Welcome, everyone. I'm Gabriella Taylor, and I just want to welcome you to Extraordinary Woman, which is a space where we're not just talking about change. We are building a movement. And I believe it is time for women and men to lead differently by transforming how we create lasting change from the inside out. And today, I am so honored to sit down with a woman who has dedicated her life to doing exactly that, Kavita Ramdas. So let's dive in because there are conversations that change the way that we see the world. And then there are conversations that change the ways that we see ourselves. So today we're here to have one of those conversations. And I am so thrilled to bring Kavita on today. So she is a woman, Kavita Ramdas is a woman that has spent her life not just talking about change, but actually making it happen. So she is a powerhouse in the global movement for gender justice. Kavita is a woman who has led some of the world's most influential organizations, from the Global Fund for Women to Open Society Foundations. She sat at tables where power is decided. She has challenged the status quo, and she has redefined what leadership looks like for women around the world. But what I really want to explore today is the woman behind the leader, the moments that have shaped her, the beliefs that she has had to break through, and the lessons that she has learned about power, about money, and the future of feminine leadership. Because there's one thing that I know for sure, and it's that every woman has a story about the moment that she realized her voice mattered. And today we get to hear hers. And so, Kavita, welcome. And I would love for you
Thank
to
you.
take us back to a moment before the titles, before the influence, when you first felt the calling. Was there a conversation? Was there a challenge? Or was there a moment in time that made you say, this is what I'm meant to do? This is what I'm here for?
Um, Salam namaste to you, Gabriella. So nice to be here and so wonderful to be able to share our thoughts with your audience. I think, in a strange way, that my first moment is of this kind of recognition was very, very early. I think I must have been 5 or 6 years old. Um, I'm the eldest of three daughters, and I was constantly surprised to hear people saying to my parents when they would meet us, we are very close in age, myself and my two sisters, and we're very close to each other. Um, and I would hear people say in front of us without missing a beat, oh, you only have three daughters, but you're still young, you can try for a son, to my mom. And my parents would very politely sort of respond and say, actually, we're very happy with our three daughters. We're not planning to have any more children. Um, and then somebody would say, no, no, but you must have a son. And my father would say, any one of my daughters is as good as any of your sons. Um, and then I would begin to feel like things were getting a little tense, and then people would usually drop it. but I, but it was something that was a very fascinating experience for me because I was growing up in India, and I was growing up in a military family. My father was serving in the Indian Navy, and interestingly, India had a female prime minister, and I was used to the idea that women ran countries. And I had also seen my father in his uniform when this little petite woman, Indira Gandhi, who was Prime Minister of India, would come to take the parade, and everybody would be standing at attention. And I was confused as to why, on the one hand, they were saying it was a sad thing to only have daughters. When, on the other hand, I was living in a country in which not only did we have goddesses, but we had a woman running the country. And so I think what that for me was a pivotal moment in some ways that has informed my life, because I think the contradictions of those two things happening simultaneously. And when I came to the United States as a student, in as a junior transfer in 1983, people would say, "Oh, don't you feel so liberated now that you've come to America?" And I was like, "You guys don't even, you've never had, you still don't have a woman head of state. You don't worship goddesses. You have no consent. This is one of the most masculine cultures that I've actually ever seen. And I come from a culture in which there's deep sense of the feminine always and all around us. And yet I had also come from a culture in which baby girls are abandoned at birth. Um, it has one of the highest female infant mortality rates in the world. The Nobel Prize winning laureate Amartya Sen wrote a book called Missing Women about India, China, and Korea, in which he talks about sun preference. And there I was as a young 5 or 6 year old having experienced the sun preference made visible. So
Mhm.
I think for me, part of my turning point has also been from a very early age to understand you can have a situation of both and. You can be a society that deeply raises up women on the one hand and then negates them and undermines them and considers them nothing in the same moment and simultaneously, and those two things don't necessarily live separated from each other. And so I think for me my life has been sort of trying to make sense of those contradictions that I experienced as a very young girl.
I'm so moved by what you're saying, and I'm listening to you just from even the perspective of wondering about, wow, I wonder how that shaped your internal relationship with yourself and even your brain and your forming self-image from the part of you that developed around, oh, it's wonderful to be a woman in a culture where goddesses are worshipped and, there's female leadership. And then also the part of you that received these messages about that, oh, it's somehow bad or wrong or a sorrowful full thing that you were a woman. And are you aware of how these 2 parts of you may have created some inner struggle in your own capacity to expand or stretch or be true to you?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think there was always this sense that I wasn't enough, not really created at all by my parents. I think we were three daughters who were very fortunate to grow up with both a mother and a father who deeply believed in us and who felt very strongly that we could do anything we wanted to do and anything we set our minds to doing. But by living inside of what was, like all cultures in the world today, almost all, was by then already a very deeply patriarchal culture. Although, and I think this is an important although the cosmology of Hinduism and many other Eastern traditions, including Buddhism and Taoism and has always been a different cosmology. And I think I experienced that because I went to schools. We had we had a lot of exposure to Christianity as I was growing up, not just because Christians are 2% of India's population, but because we happened to have a Catholic nanny who was raising us at home, and because I went to schools that were um, Protestant and Catholic. And I think the cosmology of Eastern religions is profoundly different in the sense that there isn't the same notion of a dominant male god, right? So that is interesting because I think we always understood that you couldn't have Shiva without Shakti. You couldn't have Vishnu without Lakshmi. You couldn't have, there was always this sense that the female divine, that the feminine divine was intrinsically a part, and that nature herself was, and it's Mother India. We talk about Mother India. So this notion of the powerful feminine divine was so deeply rooted that despite the overlay of millennia of patriarchal traditions, there was always this struggling and relatively strong outburst of a different cosmology that would keep coming through. And I think people can sense that when they come to India. They can see it in I mean, it's in everything, right? It's in the colors we choose and the way flowers play such an important role. And I think it partly explains why people came to seek and find themselves in religion, whether it was Steve Jobs looking for a guru, or the Beatles before him. And, I can understand it in part because I think that despite all the domination, and there has been plenty of patriarchal domination, this internal notion that actually this is a different way of thinking about the world, and it's a way of thinking about the world that is fundamentally understanding that there is deep intersectionality. And I remember the first time I came across an actual, what I would consider a manifestation of a trans being in a temple in India. And I was like, oh, they're half male and half female, and Ardhanareshwar is the term. And they are celebrated and praised and worshipped and looked up to. They are not shunned and considered other and considered different. And so, like, to try and make sense of that in our temples we had these beautiful sculptures and these beautiful free ways of expressing sexuality, whether it was in Kajura, and then in our schools and in our culture, people were like shaming you and saying, oh, you can't sit next to a boy, and you shouldn't be like this, and you shouldn't be forward, and you shouldn't be. So I think that there's a way in which, Gabriella, that I India is so full of these kinds of contradictions that I think by virtue of having grown up in it, and having parents who strongly supported us as young women to explore the very edges of who we wanted to be, um, gave me some kind of internal capacity. But I think it was also true that I struggled for a long time, because I do think that I was grappling with what was the best way to be. And my father was in the military, and those role models were of command and control and taking charge. And, for all of his wonderful supportiveness, he was also somebody who, you know, he he sort of expected us to man up. I mean, so his way of making sure his girls were going to be tough was, I learned how to throw a ball really hard and far and early on. Like, he was like, no, none of this like limp wristed girls throwing, you're going to learn to really throw a ball. You're going to learn to really be strong and physically. So I think you're right. Like, in some part of me, I was struggling with, can I be a woman? And can I do that in a way that is okay, and at the same time be the strong, capable, independent person that my parents expect me to be? Because most of the people who I see doing that, not all, but many of them, seem to be men. And I think that a few things did help in the sense of not growing up in a Western culture. And Indira Gandhi was a big piece of it, okay? To have a woman wearing something as feminine as a sari and running the country with her short hair. She didn't have like long Indian traditional hair and a bun at the back. She had short cropped hair with like a white streak. And like, so there was all these things, right? It was just like, I would worry and I would feel like, oh, maybe I'm not enough. And then I would see her and then I'd be like, okay, she can do it, and she's not doing it in pants. She's wearing a sari and she's totally cool with that. And all the other professional women who I knew in India, whether they were doctors or scientists or engineers, and there were many of them, were also all wearing saris. And so that was the other interesting thing, is like, I just think because it was India and it wasn't the US, somehow, while I wouldn't say it was easy reconciling those things inside of myself, and I think I have still struggled with them, and I still do in different ways, I think I had enough of the other that was always pulling me back and reminding me, and my conversations with my grandmothers, and, some point in which I think tampons had only just come to India, and I had said to my grandmother, oh, do you know that, you can, now I can like play sports with, and she was like, oh, we used to make them at home. And I was like, I had like never heard anybody say anything like that. And I was like, what? And she said, oh yeah, we would, if you had to make a pad, you would like use these old soft cloths and then you wrap them in a certain way. But then some of us used to just like take the rags and make it really small and make it like a little pencil, and that we would just insert it because it just made it easier. And I was just like, my grandmother is telling me how they used to make tampons. Like, I was like, it was mind blowing, and that's what I guess I meant when at the beginning of our conversation before we started recording, I said, I think one of the things we perhaps undervalue and underestimate, in part because we don't take the time to really learn, is even in the cultures that we dismiss as being sort of very traditional, we don't take the time to see how women were carving out spaces and powerful spaces of self love and self worth and self care, as well as the care of communities. In part because those things have never been considered worth learning about, right? Like we didn't learn about the people who were so called witches, who were really healers. People didn't take time to actually write down their recipes and write down their traditional healing practices because they were dismissed as being, either they were dismissed by the women who were trying to be more modern and therefore like, oh, they weren't really that interesting, or they were dismissed by the men who felt threatened by by those traditions. And I think that that has been something. I gave a TED talk in 2009 called Radical Women Embracing Tradition, and it was my recognition that I had not been spending enough time actually paying attention to the women who I was thinking about as being traditional, but actually how radical they were in terms of trying to create new spaces for women to have rights and voice and power and agency.
Mhm.
And yeah, I guess something about this conversation is making me think about that right now as well.
There's so much richness in what you've shared here, and I really appreciate the how you speak to both the both and, because for a lot of us listening and myself too, like we've grown in worlds where there was a both and. It wasn't a this or a that. And even if it extends to a father that hit us but then really loved us, then that would create the confusion around, oh, but he's hurting me, but also he really loves me. And then we might gravitate towards that. Or there's all these different ways that this juxtaposition of the both and is comprehensively complex and plays out in us. And so I really appreciate you saying that about the natural confusion that comes when there's these two very well developed parts of you that
Yeah.
seemingly are at odds. And I think I've shared with you when we had when you came over to my house for dinner for the Givingless Women Summit. But I lived in India for quite a period of time. I moved there when I was in my early 20s and was very also confused by Mother India and the reverence of the feminine. And in my first flat that I lived in, I started learning about the wife burnings when
Yeah.
when
The
they were
dowry deaths.
so when women were widowed, it
Yeah.
was
Or
expected.
sati, right.
So for those that
Sati.
might not know
Mhm.
about this, it's a practice, from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that if a woman is widowed, it is expected that she would essentially commit suicide through a
On the
kitchen
funeral
fire
pyre of her husband. I mean, it
or the
was
funeral
for
fire.
a very particular group of upper caste Indian women. It was not for all women. And this is also true that our traditions are often seen. What I've realized in the US and in the West is that our traditions are often what is described as being Indian is often a reflection of a very small sliver of what you know is a very complicated and complex society with many,
Yes.
many layers. But
Yes.
the tradition of sati, as it was called, or the practice of a woman self-immolating on the funeral pyre of her husband, was something that was practiced by particular castes in Indian tradition, the warrior castes of
Mhm.
the Rajputs, for example, in Rajasthan, and in a few other upper caste traditions. And in part, it was because there was this notion that a woman's worth and her self was all bound up in the well-being and the life of her husband, and that she really didn't want to live a life without him.
Mhm.
Um, I think that was taken to really extreme
Mhm.
um, forms, like this kind of self-immolation. But it is important to realize that it was not true for all Indian women. It was true for a
Yeah.
very particular small group of upper caste and warrior caste women. However, it is true that many upper caste women in particular were really shunned and were treated very badly as widows because it was considered that women had brought bad luck on their husbands if their husbands died before them. And so they were held responsible for their husbands having passed away. And widows were treated very poorly. They were considered, again, in upper caste India, they were considered a bad omen. So they were kept apart from the family. They were, treated with and when you go back and you look at the economic reasons often beneath those traditions, you also learn that widows became a burden on a family. There was no one to support them, there was no one to feed them, there was no one to take care of them. And so, creating a circumstance in which you shunned widows and you said, well, you didn't really need to be responsible for them, or you made their life so unbearable that they actually considered suicide a better option than staying alive in a society that shunned them and didn't allow them to come to even basic festivals. I had a very dear friend in Nepal, also someone who was born into a Hindu family, who served on the board of the Global Fund for Women many years later. And she told me how nobody would invite her anymore. She lost her husband in a tragic accident when she was in her early 30s. No one would invite her or her children to any events, even family events, because it was considered an evil omen for a widow to come to anything auspicious. And
Mhm.
how amazingly that amazing human being, Rita Thapa, transformed that and became one of the founders of the Nepal Women's Fund, TEWA, when she founded that fund with 5 friends, each of whom took off their gold bangles and put it on the table and said, let's start a fund for women in Nepal that'll be modeled after the Global Fund for Women, but it'll be our money for our sisters in Nepal. So
Mhm.
I think,
Well, and
yeah,
I really
there's so
appreciate.
much there, right? But it is
Yes.
also, yeah,
And there's so much in what I'm hearing here is just the piece of the confusion, which is really normal and natural for all of us when there's mixed messages. Be more like
yeah,
this, be less like this. You're worthy if you're like this, but if you do this, don't do it too much. And so we're just seeing like so many of us have been operating inside of a worldview and cultural narratives, no matter what our culture is, that
yeah,
has on one hand undervalued the feminine, but also has deeply relied on the feminine to nurse us, to birth
yes.
us, to feed us.
Yes,
And I
yes.
just
And to keep the patriarchy intact, actually. I think women are very key in holding up the pillars of the patriarchy because they're the ones who then teach the next generation and, set
oh,
expectations.
Kavita, let's pull back the curtain on this because this is one of my most favorite conversations that recognizes that how has internalized sexism, internalized misogyny, hatred of the feminine, how that lives in us women and that keeps us small and in fact doing the heavy lifting for the patriarchy. So your thoughts on this? This is the essence of why I love the work that I do with women and helping to resolve this from within.
Well, earlier I quoted an Algerian revolutionary thinker and writer, Frantz Fanon, and your listeners, I hope, will learn more about his extraordinary work as part of the Algerian resistance against the French colonial occupation. But one of the wonderful things he was a he was like you are very deeply interested in psychology, and he was a psychologist, and he was fascinated by the fact that how could a country like France send so few people, and yes, they had superior weapons maybe, but how could they keep an entire nation like Algeria under their thumb and under control? And he came up with one of the theories that he is famous for is what he calls the internalization of oppression, which you've just given voice to, Gabriella, right? So he presents this theory in the context of the colonized and the colonizer. But I strongly believe the first time I read this, I was like, oh my God, that's exactly what we do as women. I mean, and my husband and I had this like long, passionate conversation about it. And he said, no, absolutely, you're correct. And I said, because it is women ourselves who reproduce the structures and the frameworks and the values of patriarchy. And we do it because we have bought into the notions and the understandings and the worth that has been assigned to us within this system.
Mhm.
And then we transmit it further on.
Mhm.
So, on the treatment of widows, for example, or even on the treatment of more contemporary versions of that are what are called dowry deaths. In India, something between 17 to 20 women die every day, even today, because they have not been considered to have brought enough dowry during the negotiations for the wedding. So dowry originally was supposed to be a gift that the girl's family sent with her to tide her through hard times and have a little bit of a nest egg. What it has turned into is a transactional process. But the people who are responsible for killing these young women are not actually men.
Mm.
It's mother-in-laws and sister-in-laws and people in the family that she's married into who harass her so much or make her feel so um, miserable that she is actually forced into either committing suicide or basically they arrange some kind of an accidental death,
Mhm.
so-called accidental death.
Mhm.
And I think that this then shows up in less dramatic ways in Western societies. I've seen it all across the United States in my 30 years, 40 years of living here and working here. The ways in which women are taught to compete against each other, that our primary objects are how to secure a man or a successful husband or a successful job or a successful whatever it is, and that other women are considered our greatest competition. And instead of working from a place of inner confidence and inner truth and inner resilience, we
Mhm.
work from a space of scarcity and feeling we are not enough. And this woman is better looking than me, and therefore she'll get the better looking guy, or she'll get the better job, or she'll get the better opportunities. Um, Deep internal insecurity about the way we look, because how we look has been the primary way in which women's worth has been judged. Um, so even at the point I remember when I decided, my hair started going silver in my 20s, and my mother's before me and her mother's before her. And I was just convinced that, like, oh, I couldn't let that happen because, like, you know, I wouldn't be attractive and I would. So, I colored my hair for like 30 years almost. And for what? I mean, for some notion of what it meant to be better looking or younger looking or more attractive. And I remember when I finally stopped, I had come back from India where I had been running the Ford Foundation, and I was in a little salon in Brooklyn, and a young woman said to me, and I had not had a chance to color my roots for, I don't know, some years, from some months.
Mhm.
And she said, oh, can I ask you, why do you color your hair?
Mm.
And I thought, oh, I, I never asked myself that question. And she said, you have really pretty hair.
Mm.
Would you go home and just like think about it? And if you still want to do it, then, come back next week and I'll do it. I'm just curious. If you don't have an answer, then why are you doing it?
Mhm.
And I remember walking back, and I was 50, 53 at that point. So it was about 10 years ago. And I sat on the stoop of my Brooklyn apartment and I thought, I'd never asked myself that question.
Mm.
And I would submit that this internalization of oppression means that not only are we just kind of rushing along following whatever sets of things we think are important, but we've
Mhm.
never even stopped long enough. By which I don't mean, by the way, I encourage people to do whatever makes them joyous. if you want to have pink hair or brown hair or purple hair, please feel free, but do it with a notion of understanding of why you are doing it,
Yes.
why you're choosing to, whatever it is. If you want to do Botox or you want to do fillers or you, I
Yes.
am making no judgment on that. But what I am making a plea for all of us is to say to ourselves, how much of the decisions that we are making for ourselves and our own lives are being driven from things we don't even know are driving us?
Mm.
And how much are we choosing from a place of grace, from a place of ease, from a place of comfort with ourselves, of what we want to do,
Mm.
how we want to dress, what we want to wear, what color our hair should be, you know, and how much has come from an internalized notion of pleasing, which girls are taught to do from a very early age.
Mhm.
Um, and then it becomes so much a habit that we don't even know anymore
Mm.
that it's a habit. So I
Mhm.
guess that's for me that question that you're asking about our internalization of these notions of what is to be seen as threatening. Why is another woman seen as threatening? Why do we have to keep her in her place? Why these things are not going to be addressed by us
Mhm.
if we don't take the time to look inside ourselves a little bit. And
Yeah.
I actually think that's what Audre Lorde meant when she said self-care is a form of political resistance.
Mhm.
For
Mm.
me, that's actually what she means, is that if we don't take the time to look inside ourselves and we don't take the time to actually understand ourselves and love ourselves, then we are going to be acting from this place of internalized oppression.
Yes.
And we're not even going to be aware that we're acting from that place.
Yes. There's
So,
so much in here because what I'm hearing is the foundations of not only how we reshape culture amongst women, and also our own the ecosystem within, which is individual, because it is, again, there's the both and I mean, this is why I run my feminine power incubator circles for women. And really, I believe that we each have to, in a way, deconstruct the very paradigm from whence we've come. And the paradigm has taught us that as the feminine, we are less than, and that has backed us into a corner. And our only
right,
option has been to acquiesce, to please, to harden up, or to fight
right,
back. And so,
correct,
given statistics are showing us
correct.
that workplace harassment is worst amongst women, and
Yeah,
given the rate of,
yeah,
and again, whether you choose to do plastic surgery or other body modification things, the intention behind it is what we need to sort of get honest
correct,
behind, because the
correct,
amount of money that goes into the beauty
correct.
industry and into these practices that effectively continue to reinforce this narrative that I'm not okay and
Yeah,
that I need to be pleasing to you,
yeah,
or the heck with it all and I'm just going to harden up and shut down my heart and,
yeah,
suffer in aloneness. So I really appreciate and this is what I love doing with female leaders who lead big organizations, is looking at how are you unintentionally reenacting the very system that you're seeking to break down and reconstruct.
yes,
And to me, it's like, this is not our fault. This is not to shame or blame, but it is our responsibility.
yes,
It's not
exactly.
our fault that we do
Yes,
these things, but
yes.
it is our responsibility. And I'm
And I think that's an actually a very interesting line there, Gabriella, because I think for many of us, and I would definitely include myself, we don't really understand the difference between my fault and my responsibility.
mm,
So let's sit with this for a little bit.
mhm,
Yesterday, I said something to my husband about, oh, I've been in India for these last 2 months and I haven't really had a glass of wine. And so I'm going to have a glass of wine. And he just looked at me and he was like, you're entitled to have a glass of wine
mm,
just because you would like to have a glass of wine. You don't have to, like, there's no, like that. And then I kind of talked to him because he's a fellow feminist and we've both learned so much together. We've also unpacked so many things about our assumptions about what is feminist and what is not. And because he's been the stay-at-home parent and has been the caregiver in our family and in our relationship, one of the most fascinating things for me as a feminist leader who has been leading organizations and who has been out in the world and who is the external, I'm very externally focused, and he has been doing all of the things that we think of traditionally as being feminine.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, One of the interesting things that we notice is as different is that he said, I very rarely feel like I have to give any reasons or rationales for why I do something. And he said, I think that is because of my privilege of having been born into a male body and being socialized as a male, so that even though I have, and he's deeply in tune with what I think the world might see as being feminine characteristics. He is just by nature an extraordinary caregiver.
Mm.
And by accident of fate and the fact that the two of us are together and that we worked out something, he's been able to manifest his caregiving in a way that has felt comfortable and spacious for him, and has felt very rewarding and supportive for me.
Mm.
But I think this question about fault and responsibility, for many women, if not for a vast majority of us, it is a line that we truly don't know how to draw.
Mhm.
It is a space in which, because we feel so profoundly responsible for everything,
Yes.
for the state of the world, for the well being of our children, for the way our house looks, for the way we look, for the whether our husband has put on weight or not put on weight, whether our parents are well cared for, whether our siblings are in touch with us. There's this overwhelming sense that we are somehow responsible for all of it.
Yes.
And there's that beautiful quote in the Torah, in the Talmud, that says, do not be overwhelmed by the world's grief, you
Mhm.
know,
Mhm.
um, walk gently on the earth, do justice now. You are not compelled to address everything, but neither are you.
Mhm.
I'm not remembering the quote completely, but it's beautiful. And it says, you're not absolved of doing your part, but you're not responsible for all of it.
Yes. Yes.
And I think actually, I would be so curious to hear what you're learning in your workshops, because I think I certainly have struggled all my life with this sense of, oh my goodness, if it isn't done, then it's my fault. You
Mhm.
know, like, even if it has nothing to do with me, that's absolutely, I cannot be responsible for everything. But somehow, this deep sense that
Mm.
the lack of clarity between it is your responsibility to take something on, whereas it's not your fault. I don't know if you found this to
Yeah.
be something women struggle with, but I certainly struggle with it a lot.
Oh, I'm very moved by the nuance here because it's such a poignant nuance, and what I see having had the opportunity and real privilege to walk hundreds into thousands of women through these conversations in themselves and to really grapple with, well, what does this mean from me? To shift from a feeling of either over responsibility for everything around me, or equally the shadow side of the feminine, a sense of under responsibility. I
Yeah,
can't do it, or my boss will do it, or dad will rescue me.
yeah.
I
That's
have
true.
no
That's the other
power.
side. That is the shadow side.
That is
100%.
the shadow side.
100%.
And I find that with so much of this, it is linked to core shame and unworthiness and the feeling that I have to,
Yeah.
because
As
to
opposed to
give
I
me a
choose
sense,
to.
as opposed to I choose to,
Yeah.
or nobody will help me. The shadow side of it is out of a feeling of invisibility and unworthiness, and there's no
Yes.
one here. And so to
Yes.
me, I
Yes.
find, and you probably see this a lot, and even with what you were saying, sort of the beginning of the unacknowledged strengths of the feminine and unacknowledged strength of heart, that I find not only this is what the brain responds to when we're talking about coming into a more integrated brain
Yeah.
state and psychological state, yet our being resonates so deeply with compassion. And what is
Yeah.
compassion? It's the ability to be with suffering. And
Yes.
so I find just even that bridge of
Yeah.
being able to be with the suffering that we've known through this over responsibility and the pressures and the burdens we've carried or the feelings of helplessness, when we can bring and bear witness to with one another that
Yeah.
strength of heart, of that divine feminine strength that shows up and
Yes,
shows up for our loved ones and
yes,
shows up in whether it's milks the cows or goes to work or goes to the office, but
yeah,
that shows up out of love and where we
yeah,
can bear witness to the suffering
yeah,
and be a
yeah,
presence of kindness
yeah,
and caring. So much dissolves and resolves and also comes together.
yes.
And I'd love to go.
But we rarely, I think what is true, Gabriella, is that it is very difficult in the world that we currently inhabit to
Mhm,
find that right balance, or that right integration, rather, as you said, where it just dissolves into, like, you can just be that way,
mhm,
instead I think you're constantly struggling to figure out, oh, that's what I meant by the story about um, Secretary of State Clinton.
mhm. Yes.
um, I felt like Hillary was not even capable of giving herself the grace
Mhm,
to allow. She could not feel compassion for herself.
mhm, mhm,
She was not able. There was so much of demand to show that in order to be a leader, you have to be tough.
mhm,
That there's no recognition. And it's so strange because women bear children. And it's like, is there anything that's more difficult than laboring, and in which you actually literally put, even today in 2025, it's still one of the most life threatening things we can do is actually bear another life. And
mhm,
women do it all the time. Like when people say, well, but you don't go into war, I'm like, we are constantly putting our lives on the line. Like, in order to bring new life into the planet, we are constantly putting our own lives on the line each time. I
mhm,
mean, really, by rights, no woman in her right mind should have another child after she has one, right? And yet, women do it
yes,
all the time. So
yes,
we know that we're capable of great courage, and we know that we're capable of incredible um, resilience and
yes,
strength.
yes.
And yet, we kind of fall back into these tropes of like, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy enough, I'm not strong enough, I need to be rescued.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's
Well, and this is where I sense part of the revolution, if you will, is to normalize support because
yes,
we live in a
correct,
culture that is swung, from over, dependence and reliance on to like unhealthy independence. And for
correct.
us women to normalize support, like
Yes.
I wonder if Hillary had the support that she needed to really explore what does leadership from within mean. I don't know what she's doing today, what she was doing then as it
Yeah,
relates to it. And
yeah,
to me, this is why I really I like to say, while most of my clients are female leaders, they're founders or they're funders of extraordinary movements, but I use the analogy of just like when mom sort of like gets a clue, the whole family improves. When mom is supported, the whole family improves. When mom discovers a sense of power and agency, the whole family approves. This is why I really like to work with women that are at the top of meaningful organizations because the ripple effect is really quite phenomenal. And
yeah.
but this piece with normalizing support, normalizing supporting the female leaders, but even one of the when I first came
But
up with
actually, even normalizing supporting all leaders and each other.
true,
I mean, I
true.
think something that I notice very different about American culture to cultures even now in more traditional societies, you know, in societies in the global majority, is that it is more normal
Mhm,
to ask for help and to have other people be part of your community. In the US, there's an almost obsessive notion of this rugged individualism
mhm,
that is very, very unique to American culture. And it's been glorified in a way that makes it really hard, even if you're a woman in that space. The stories of the pioneer women and the stories of they're all these like, amazing, I can do it by myself. I didn't need anybody. And there's not as much of the, like, if you go to an African village or an Asian village or a Latin American village, people are like, of course I couldn't have done it by myself. Are you crazy? of
mhm,
and so all the groups that we supported from the Global Fund for Women, it was always so interesting to me that their model of leadership was not like one amazing shiro,
mhm,
who was like, against all odds, here I am fighting. It was like a bunch of really amazing women who came together and were like, you know what? Kids in our community have to learn, and we are going to get a school no matter what. Or, you know what? It's time for a grain mill in our village because we are spending all our time pounding the grain, and girls can't go to school if they're spending 7 hours a day pounding grain, and they need to go to school.
Yeah.
So we need so I think that there is a way, Gabriella, that this notion of mutual support, and now, right now, in this moment, I even see it in the way that white liberals, forgive me, my best friends, are reacting to this moment of crisis of, okay, we lost that election, and now, oh my God, the world is falling apart. And I'm like, the rest of the world has had to deal with strong men and with authoritarians and with war and with genocide. And, the world does not revolve around the United States. And if the United States would be willing to just say, hey,
Mhm.
guys, how did you manage when you were going through this? What strategies did you use? What did your women's movements do? How did you deal with the fact that abortion was made illegal? Listen, Latin America can tell you like
Mhm.
100. Just talk to the women in Argentina, just talk to the women in Chile, talk to the women in Guatemala and El Salvador, and
Mhm.
across the continent of Africa and all across Asia. We have so much to share. But
Mhm.
Americans are so terrified of asking for help because it will somehow seem like the great, exceptional, we are the greatest, we are the great. I'm like, who cares about being the greatest? How about just being in community with countries in the rest of the world? you
Yes.
know you the whole problem with thinking in a linear way,
Mhm.
in a line there's someone at the beginning and someone at the end. In a circle there's no end and no beginning. We're
Mhm.
all in this together, and if we as women cannot present the feminine notion of the circle and the globe as a way for us to rethink how we're going to do this, that's what you just said. That's the being in community, is thinking in a circle.
Yes. And
We're
even
going to do this
beyond
together.
beyond that, which we have so much to learn from the ways that we've forgotten, I even just think about how the whole myth of self-regulation, like our human body, like fun fact, the way that our brains are formed, we cannot access self-compassion. We literally do not have the neural circuitry until we have had enough through the resonant circuits and mirror neurons, enough of compassion being offered to us from another
Other.
requires
Exactly.
another. And until
Exactly.
we have enough of the warm presence of loving eyes, a caring heart reflecting to us compassion, that circuitry actually does not come online.
Again. Right.
And
And we know this from like child development.
yes,
We
yes.
know this from, why orphans who are left in institutions do so much more poorly than children who are raised in loving, supportive families.
Mhm.
So yeah, I agree. And I
Bottom
know that it's
line,
really late. And I
yes.
know my wonderful, compassionate partner is waiting on dinner.
So
So
as we wrap up, so you can get to your wonderful, compassionate partner, I just want to thank you for being here, Kavita. I so deeply appreciate your bright mind, your bold heart. And this is one of those conversations where I had a series of questions and we went somewhere else, and I love where we went. And I just, let's keep going there. And so I just want to thank you for being here and for all of the beautiful work that you have done. And for those listening today, I just ask you to reflect upon what is one thing that you can take away from this conversation between Kavita and myself that you can take with you. Maybe it's the healing of shame. Maybe it's the healing of this idea around needing to go it alone. Maybe it's a willingness to hold the both and of the complexity of things. Maybe it's the reckoning with, yes, we all have different parts of ourselves that shaped around mixed messages, and that's just part of it. Maybe there are hidden strengths inside of you. So, Kavita, thank you for being here. Thank you for this wonderful time together. And I wish you a beautiful dinner with your husband.
Oh, Gabriella, thank you so much. And I just want to add for your listeners that I think there's there's so much joy and so much sense of solidarity that I think there is to be gained by realizing that, however difficult it may seem at this moment, we are actually part of a global community. And this global community stands ready to be at our service as women facing a particularly challenging moment right now inside the United States, and frankly, for many men inside the United States who do not envision this as the way in which they want to live their lives. And so I hope your messages about building community, finding this compassion, understanding that we need that mirroring from the people around us to be able to reflect it further and to take that further is so important. And so I'm so grateful to you, Gabriella, for this podcast and for sharing these messages. And I really look forward to listening to your other wonderful guests and listening to the rest of this, and lessons to share. Thank you so
Lessons
much.
to share.
Namaste.
Namaste. Mhm.